Infrastructure, Enterprise, and Utility Oversight Committee to order. We'll go ahead and do introductions, starting on my left.
Cameron Perez Verdia.
Scott Myers.
Anna Brawley.
Meg Zolotel.
Christopher Constant.
On the phone, Mr. Johnson.
Here.
All right. Karen?
Yep.
Felix?
Present.
All right. Again, I seem to always end up in chairing a meeting on a Friday afternoon, so first names are totally fine. It's about the bandwidth I have left. So I called this meeting for a couple of reasons. One is Randy.
I'm here. Thank you.
Great, thanks. I called this meeting, this is our first opportunity really with the new administration to dig in deep with the port. I know we have some milestones coming up, particularly as it relates to construction on Terminal 1. Also wanting to make sure that we were either on track or we're aware of any potential changes that need to come up. We were last briefed a couple of months ago, particularly around the port modernization project, and we were told some things would be coming our way. So I think this is the opportunity for us to do that. You have a couple of documents. One is our original authorization, authorizing and approving the adoption of Tariff 10, which is what authorized the surcharge concept. That will be coming up in a part of the conversation today. And then quite a comprehensive slide deck from the administration. This is really, frankly, like the history of the whole project and where we're at and how to move forward. It is quite the compendium. It's pretty awesome. So I'm going to turn it over, but what I want to do is take this in 4 sections because it's a big PowerPoint. So we first want to go over the timeline, then want to talk about cranes, then want to talk about finance, and then talk about any direction we want to provide forward on this particular project. With that, I will turn it over to the administration.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And as an initial note, this is our first update as a new administration to this body regarding the Port of Alaska Modernization Project. So please do give us feedback on what is helpful, what is too much, what is too little, trying to strike a balance for the diversity of the membership of this body in terms of the update that we bring, and trying to roll together the various different component pieces of what reports up to us via actual project management of the project, legal management, management of the port itself. And so again, feedback welcome on how the scope of these updates rolls out over time. As the chair noted, our goal today is to address the issues that were requested for review. We'll talk first about timeline, specifically where we are in our progress toward the award, the T1 construction contract. The spoiler on that is we are a few weeks behind what we anticipated being as our schedule, but we do not anticipate that that has long-term ripple effects in terms of the actual commencement of construction. Number 2, we'll talk about commencement of the NEPA process for review for T1 construction. And there, the spoiler is we actually have had some engagement from MARAD, which is good news. So we think that we are poised to commence a conversation with them and move forward with that process, where I know we've been in a holding pattern and waiting engagement. We'll then talk about what's next, specifically the cranes, how we are contracting for them. I knew there were some questions from this body about the interplay of the 3 crane related contracts, the crane agreement, the crane use agreement, and the T1 construction contract. And there again, jump in if it's too much background, not enough detail, too much detail as we go through the scope of those agreements. And we'll talk about when we'll be back in front of the body to relay terms of those 3 agreements for approval. And then Mr. Falsey will dive in depth into the plan of finance, where we are, what comes next. All right, so first, a few words on timeline. This is what I understand was last presented to the body as what was anticipated for the T1 construction contract timing, and this is where we are right now. So you'll see there's a slight change. We were anticipating bidder selection by August 20th. We're now anticipating bidder selection by September 19th. That change was driven by the need for additional time to respond to bidder questions. We had some asks from the bidders to take a little bit more time, and thus we've kicked that back by about a month. And so the end result you'll see in the slide is that we end up about 3 weeks behind in getting into the limited notice to proceed, but do not anticipate further ripple effects from there forward. But if there are questions, Mr. Adams is here to answer questions about how that might play out after the LNTP is issued.
So I noticed the present to this committee is September 26th. That meeting is actually on the 19th. Do you
Okay.
need to have a special meeting or a work session because of the other bidder selection date being on the 19th?
Through the chair, yes, I would request a special EOC meeting so we can make the October 8th assembly agenda. And with that, it doesn't meet the required 2 or 3 weeks ahead to get on their assembly agenda. So it'd have to be proper procedure. I'm not sure, laid on the table or an amendment.
Well, you'd be more than welcome to go ahead and submit anything to the agenda, and then we would just make sure we could have a committee meeting in between before we actually take it up on October 8th. And in fact, I would hope as much space, maybe 2 meetings worth of space could possibly be between that introduction and the date we're going to hear it, and we can get a meeting in between. That's going to be a big item, and I want us to make sure we have plenty of space to have as many meetings as we might need to have so that when we do take it for public hearing, we're ready to take action.
Yeah, so the bids open September 19th, 3 p.m. And so anytime you guys want to set after that, we'll be able to support that.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, thank you. Any other questions on the timeline? And if you're online, you just, I guess, have to speak up or shoot me a text. Okay.
All right, so moving on to the next item in the timeline front, talking about the NEPA process. So I know I understand that it has been communicated to this body previously that we were having challenges in getting MARAD to be willing to engage directly with us to have essentially a kickoff meeting for the NEPA process, which we were waiting on before we moved forward with the submission of our draft EA. And the good news is that we have had communication with MARAD over the last week that they are now working with us to target September 4th for that initial meeting. And so we, rather than submit the draft prior to the meeting, we would like to take the course of meeting with them first, hearing feedback, and then we will move forward with that. But we feel optimistic that that means that we now have about a year to get to the required date for completion of the NEPA process from that date of commencement. And based on the prior experience, I understand that the project team and working through the NEPA process for the PCT and NES1, we believe that this is a achievable goal, but there I'll take questions as well if there are questions or concerns about the NEPA timing.
So I don't know that everyone is quite as aware as what the NEPA is and why it's required. Could you explain just briefly what the NEPA is required for?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So National Environmental Preservation Act requires review of a variety of different things by a lead agency for any project that has a federal hook. If we have federal funding, if we have federal approval. I spent a lot of time with this act in my last life doing federally funded telecommunications projects or projects that were licensed by the FCC. And so here, if we are pursuing federal grant funding or federal any other federal support for T1, we will need to go through the complete NEPA process with agency. Anything else you want to add to that?
No, it's a similar process that we've done on PCT and NES1. This is just for the cargo terminals now.
And I think I might just clarify that this is the second MARAD NEPA process that we're going through for the terminal, correct? Because we have the
We did it for
this timeline is actually tied to the TIFI alone rather than for the PIPD grant, which we'll talk about later.
Any further questions about the NEPA process, what it entails, why we're doing it? Okay. Then on to what's next. As has already been noted, the slide deck shows us needing to come back before this body to review the contracts, including there's 3 contracts in this pack, and we'll get into what those are next. But we will, again, as noted already, request a special meeting to review those contracts so we can make sure we have reviewed them before they are introduced on the assembly agenda. So what are those contracts? Gross oversimplification here with pictures. We'll have 3 pieces here. The first is a construction contract with the T1 construction contractor yet to be selected through the current procurement process. Then there's a second contract called the Crane Agreement. And the Crane Agreement concerns the agreement between Matson and the municipality of Anchorage, whereby Matson agrees to purchase, procure, transport, install, and subsequently operate the cranes on T1 at the port. And then again, the third agreement is the crane use agreement, which governs how those cranes are used over time by Matson and what permissible uses the municipality retains the right to, although those cranes will be owned by Matson. So again, 3 agreements that will be finalized together, and we feel it's very important that they are finalized together because they work together to make sure that this is an arrangement that protects the best interests of the municipality. And I understand that this body has previously affirmed and communicated that that is what you'd like to see as well, that those 3 agreements hang together. So again, it's that T1 construction contract governing the responsibilities of the contractor to complete the construction of T1. It's in the procurement package, which is already subject to the process underway. And then it includes, and we'll delve into this in greater detail in a moment, includes language governing damages that are due to the municipality by the construction contractor if the dock is not sufficiently complete in time to allow for timely crane installation by Matson. We'll talk again in a minute about how the interplay there, what that actually translates to in terms of dollars, and with the position that puts the municipality in with respect to potential financial risk. Then there's the crane agreement, which is the agreement between the municipality and Matson, under which Matson agrees to procure, transport, deliver, et cetera, the new cranes, and includes the language governing damages that the municipality will pay to Matson in turn if the dock isn't complete in time for the installation. And then we have the use agreement, which is that agreement for use of the cranes over time and is critical to preserving the degree of operational flexibility that the municipality desires in over time for the use of those cranes, again, though they will actually be owned by Matson. In advance of this meeting, I had a couple questions about kind of how did we get here? How did we get to this paradigm of Matson purchasing the cranes themselves? Why did we decide that this was the best structure? And so again, with apologies if this is entirely redundant, I did a kind of a 360-degree walk around this to make sure I understood why we believe this was the best paradigm for us. Again, noting that the currently MOA, the municipality owns the current cranes with Matson operating pursuant to the use agreement. I understand that the new structure is desirable for Matson because it aligns with what they do in their infrastructure in Hawaii and other ports in which they operate. I know there's a question about, is this something that happens in other ports? And we did some looking at other West Coast ports. We know that there are examples on the West Coast, including Long Beach and Los Angeles, in which this kind of model of the operator owning the actual crane infrastructure is in place. So it is not an extraordinary model. There's the capital cost concern, where under this model, the capital cost of the cranes and the transport cost are borne by Matson rather than by the municipality. And then also in avoiding the ensuing complications of whether those costs then are borne through the surcharge increase or through the creation of some kind of separate cost causer, cost payer user fee that only applies to Matson as the user of the cranes. And then also as an overlay that we believe that we can actually preserve flexibility for other uses of the cranes through the terms of the crane use agreement. That's actually an element of the current use agreement. I imagine many of you are familiar with that the current agreement that the municipality has with Matson does actually contain provisions governing what kind of uses the municipality has the eligibility for. And we anticipate, again, negotiating that kind of hitting that negotiating point with Matson in that agreement, the forward-looking agreement as well. Okay. Again, this doesn't come without risks. And I think I would categorize those risks as operational and financial. The operational risk, again, being that we don't preserve adequate flexibility because we have some very real needs for humanitarian, DoD, Homeland Security, FEMA uses, and other intermittent uses that we know from past experience will arise and that are critical for the service that the port needs to perform for the state. And the other one is, again, the financial use, which is that we will be contractually obligated to pay damages to Matson if the dock isn't complete in time. And we end up in the middle of what I'm going to affectionately call the damages sandwich, where we basically are getting damages from the construction contractor and then turning over and handing them over to Matson. And there's potential for some gap in there that actually causes the municipality to incur liability. And I want to talk a little bit more about that. Oh, it looks like a question.
Yeah, just quickly expand on the risk of flexibility and what our experience in the past has been with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Through the chair, from our what I understand from, actually I can ask Mr. Buffo to speak to that in greater depth.
Well, in my experience, Steve Rebuffo, our port director. In my experience, there really hasn't been any risk in the past. This is an interesting economic market, and it's pretty saturated now with respect to users that could potentially use the gantry cranes. I've not seen a time when we've had an issue with a potential delivery that would need to use the cranes that wouldn't have access to them.
I think if I might add to, sorry, I apologize, Madam Chair. I would say though, to add, I think that building from what Mr. Rebuffo said, what we want to do in the future is preserve the degree of flexibility we have right now, because right now we do have the flexibility to allow the DoD to use the cranes, Homeland Security to use the cranes, FEMA, and things like Ambler Metals to use the crane if they need to in order to transport things. I understand there was a German carrier that showed up and needed to move a certain like loads of items in and out of it, like on an intermittent basis, not a third carrier who was going to be using the cranes consistently. That's not, I think, the risk we're trying to preserve flexibility for, but it's the one-off uses or kind of occasional intermittent uses that the port to be able to preserve the to address. Yeah. Did my mic just die? Oh, it revived.
Just a closing comment that I appreciate that. And so those are built into the user agreement. There is some language in there in terms of that kind of flexibility. I mean, I assume that we want to keep it as it is, but we can't predict the future. And so knowing that that's going to be a need, is that something that language we built into the user agreement?
So through the chair, that's what we're working to do right now. We're negotiating a new agreement because the use agreement that we have right now will be mooted by the new ownership structure. And so we're not over the line yet. We're still negotiating with Matson, but our objective is to preserve this set of flexibilities in that agreement. And that's one of the reasons that it's important that we bring all three agreements to conclusion at the same time, because they all hang together. And this is the key, is making sure we've preserved the operational flexibility we need.
I don't know that we've seen the current crane use agreement, so that might be just something good for us to have a barometer by which to look at maybe when the new one comes forward.
Sure thing.
I am curious, are we looking at a provision or like a provision in case of Matson deciding to leave our market so that we could buy the crane or continue to have the cranes in this agreement?
I'll let Steve, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, that's the same as in the current agreement. So it only makes sense to do that. Yeah.
Great. Let's
Okay.
continue.
So that I can go on to, I think, the more complex piece, which is this, again, the damages sandwich. So this is just a quick, background on the phasing of port construction, which I imagine you all have been through multiple times, but just that we'll begin work in third quarter 2025, and that the key, this all comes into play in 2027 when we have the first portion of the dock complete and the cranes on site, moving toward cranes being operational. And so here's just another view of the time frame for the arrival and installation of the cranes. We need to have the first 540 feet complete by August 15th of 2027. That gives us the window for crane delivery and then for Matson to bring them into full operability. I asked a bunch of probably silly questions about trying to figure out if we could push this back. It turns out that this is very fixed based on shipping concerns about getting into cook inlet in the fall before we experience freeze up. So this is just a quick background on what those phases look like. This is the first scope of work 1.1, which is that first 540 feet. And then we go into scope of work 1.2, which brings the dock to 748 feet. And so then we'll go into the phases of the damages sandwich. And this is where, again, I think what we're aiming to do here is to build this 3-contract package where we minimize the possibility for the municipality to lose out in this multi-step process. So here the blue arrows are tied to the construction agreement. The orange arrows are tied to the crane agreement. So basically, at August 15th is our scope 1.1 deadline. It's supposed to have 540 feet of the dock. What happens there if the construction contractor misses that deadline, they start to pay the municipality $58,000 per day in liquidated damages, so fixed amount, And then we turn around and under the construction contract, we pay actual damages to Matson, which are estimated at $58,000 a day. So there, the risk point being that we have estimated incorrectly, and somehow we end up liable for more than the $58,000 per day. Again, the intent in this was building it to be based on an estimate that we believed in, and we felt like we would be able to come out of this whole. But that is to tag. That's the risk in phase one of the damages sandwich. Any questions?
I do. What drives Matson's estimated damages at $58,000 a day?
Mr. Adams, you want to talk to that?
Through the chair, the $58,000 a day, when we first started looking at this, we came back and Jacobs did provide their own estimate, and it's very close to that number. Then we reached out to Matson, and when they reached out to the bidders and went through the RFP process, this is the number, they came back with the number of 58,000 as well.
But what is the actual damages?
Oh, it's
What are we
the-
paying for?
Okay, basically we're paying for the ship. When you see the large cranes arrive on a large ship, for that crane to sit out there for a week, if we miss that August 15th date, you're paying for that ship to spin circles 24 hours a day.
Okay, great. So quite the show, very expensive show. And then what, I see us doing liquidated damages. Why wouldn't we just charge the contractor actual damages, which would then encapsulate the Matson damages? Because we might have other damages beyond what the delay with Matson would be.
It's a very good question. It's because our contract bidders on the contract said they would not bid if that was a requirement of the contract. So ended up being a gating item.
Okay.
Can I jump in here? We actually tried that, and in the bidders that we selected said that nobody will bid on it if we don't.
Okay,
So that-
understandable. Cameron?
Just, is there a buffer that built into ours, I would assume, that we are sort of estimating a tad high to, yes?
Through the chair, there will be actual damages that we pay up to Matson, but we do have a buffer. When I say like the timeline, so that August 15th timeline, in November of 2026, at the end of the construction season, we'll have a pretty good idea if we're going to make that August 15th date or not. And we will be able, we can't really shift past the September 15th date because that's when the shippers really get concerned because they need a couple weeks to offload the cranes. And at that time in November 2026, we will be able to shift that timeline by a couple weeks.
Thanks.
Mike, Mr. Presbyter, was your question really, do we think 58 is high? So we
Yeah,
think we'll come in under that.
That was the real question was, is there a
Yeah.
financial buffer?
We didn't
put
cut
into
like
that
the
estimate?
lowest possible estimate. And
Right.
Mr. Adams, can you speak to that?
We took the estimated hour cost directly from Matson. And
Right.
so ours was about $60,000. But as any additional liquidated damages you put in the contract, it drives the contract price up. And
Sure.
so speaking with the previous administration, we went with this number.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions about the damages sandwich here? Okay, please continue.
All right, we'll get on to the second damages sandwich. And with apologies, I was working on this late at night, so I got a little punchy. And so second phase damages sandwich, we hit September 15th, and then something slightly different happens. At that point, if the construction contractor still has not completed scope 1.1, then the contractor, pursuant again to that blue arrow, the construction contract, pays the municipality liquidated damages of $18.5 million. That's not a random number. That's the estimated expense of storing the cranes through the winter while we wait to be able to install them, hopefully after completion of the required portion of the dock. And then in turn, we turn around and we start paying Matson actual damages with a bunch of asterisks and caveats, right? So there is a duty to mitigate clause that's being negotiated in the contract right now. So they do have a duty to try and take steps to minimize those damages, either by working with the municipality to find the most affordable location for crane storage, and eventually up to the point of selling the cranes to the municipality for an amount not to exceed $82 million, which is the estimated actual cost of the cranes themselves. And so the goal of the transaction structure, again, being down there in yellow, is that we either most likely take those liquidated damages from the construction contractor, turn around and use them to store the cranes, to pay Matson to store the cranes, and we're just to pass through. Cranes are stored, we're able to move forward. And or less likely we end up purchasing the cranes for all in less than we would have paid if we from the beginning had to buy them and transport them ourselves. And I realize there's a lot of asterisks on that because even though it's, we have up to $82 million in actual damages offset by 18.5 in liquidated damages, but I will be the first to concede that does not include other potential costs, including, even if we buy them, we'll have to figure out how to store them. We'll have to then be the ones to transport them back up. There will likely be, legal and other transactional costs involved in this. But the idea of the structure is for the cost of storage to be fully borne by that liquidated damages pass through, or the absolute backstop for the municipality to have the option to purchase the cranes for overall an amount that doesn't exceed what we would have paid to buy them ourselves.
So this is an issue that's come up in other contexts, but when we start storing large capital assets, would we assume liability for the cranes during the period of storage?
If we owned them?
No,
Oh.
if we simply are storing them, right? Because our contractors paid us liquidated damages, our agreement with Matson, we've got them into a storage. Are we liable for the cranes and the value of the cranes during that storage period? Or would there be
Yeah.
some split or something? And it might be a TBD, but it is a concern, I think.
Yeah, no, I'll actually ask Mr. Bowman to comment on that, but I believe that the agreement says that because if we're paying for the storage by paying actual damages to Matson, they still own them. They're actually accountable for storing them. We're just paying the bill. But I'll let Mr. Bowman speak directly to that since he's closer to the agreement than I am.
Through the chair, that is an accurate characterization. The way the agreement is structured is that until the municipality owns the cranes, they still belong to Matson even during the storage period. So Matson would be responsible for the cranes during that time period. If we reach the $82 million mark, which basically means everything has gone completely pear-shaped, then when we own the cranes, we would obviously become liable for them.
Great, thank you. My only other question, because really, right, this is this like fail-safe mechanism on kind of the construction side of things, is how hard is it going to be to find storage for cranes? I mean, this feels like a big task. And so is it within the scope of reality that we would have safe storage for cranes that would satisfy the parties?
It is, and I'll let Mr. Adams speak to it, yeah.
Thank you, through the chair. Yes, Matson has identified a place, and also in the Greater Jacobs Network, we've identified a few other ports who could accept these right now, and one of them is in Washington. But we'd have to work through Matson and the shipper on that. But we have identified other ports, and Matson has one identified as well.
Thank you. Any other questions on this damage sandwich? Okay, we'll keep going.
All right, my final damages sandwich, I promise. This is phase 3. So we get to October 15th, and we have actually gone through, at this point, the construction contractor has actually constructed the first portion of the dock. The cranes can be installed, but then they miss the completion of the scope 1.2 deadline. So then we just end up in, again, this damages sandwich looks a little bit more like the first one, where we end up with liquidated damages from the T1 construction contractor of $85,000 per day, and we turn around and pay actual damages to Matson, which again, based on an estimate of what those damages actually would be. Do you speak to how we reached that estimate?
Yeah. So basically, after the cranes have landed and we're at the 748 feet, that is if Matson can't begin the commissioning of the cranes through the winter, let's say the power system isn't up and running, we estimated how much it would cost to make sure we have standby generators and all that stuff on place. And to answer an earlier question, this does have a little buffer in there. And so we did bump that up on that one.
Okay, so the upshot is we're still working through these 3 agreements. And again, as you know, to finish where we started, the plan is to come back to this body with once the negotiation of all 3 agreements is concluded, to give an update when we are ready and a review when we are ready to move forward with requesting approval. Again, that construction contract is in the bid package proceeding through the process. The other 2 crane agreements are in negotiation. We just received edits yesterday. So we'll continue to work through those operational flexibility and financial terms. And just kind of at the bottom, the administration's take on this, which we inherited of, is this the right structure for the municipality? And our recommendation is yes, especially right now, it is the right structure for the municipality. We are now fairly far down this road, and there are delay risks that would come with changing the approach right now. And we do believe that we can preserve that operational flexibility through the contract process, and that the damages sandwich structure does considerably mitigate the financial risk to the municipality and at least bring it on par with, if we purchase the cranes ourselves, we would also carry financial risk, right? If we had them, we drove, and the T1 construction contractor failed to complete and the either scope and time, we would incur damages as well. So we are comfortable that the scope of financial damages we will potentially carry as a municipality is on par with or less than what we would carry in the alternate scenario, provided we are able to reach the conclusions we would like to in the 3 agreements that are subject to negotiation right now.
Thanks. And does it seem that an approval date of October 8th works fine for what the steps Matson needs to take in order to procure cranes and get its process rolling?
Do you want to speak to that?
Yes, through the chair, and I'm sure Mattson will speak after this as well. And we've been in constant, Dylan and I speak regularly on this every day or every other day. They have a final deadline, I believe, shortly after that October 8th meeting to get the purchase order. And we're meeting next week to finalize the negotiations on the crane agreement.
Great, thank you. When we get that drop dead date, that would be really great for us to know because that will simply be our public hearing date. And if becomes a must pass item, we want to make sure we are planning accordingly to get all members' questions answered. Thank you.
Okay. If there are no further questions on the crane agreement, I will turn it over to Mr. Falsey for the financial show portion of the afternoon.
All right. Thank you, Manager Wynn-Peterson, to the chair, to the body. As we turned into the plan of finance slides, I'll say at the outset, apologies if this is a little more than you wanted. I felt like this was a good time to take stock of where we were. First, just to review the bidding for the assembly, but mostly for the public too. I think this is a big enough project that there is value in reviewing the bidding from time to time. Second, to say that you've got a new administration team that's plugging back into the system that you have stewarded for the last 3 years. We want you to have some confidence that we see what you see and that we are advancing the ball as it is continuing to roll down the hill. So moving through this, it is also a time to take stock of this because we are about to take the next big step, as you all well know. So we have moved through the petroleum cement terminal and the south floating dock. We are finished or in the midst of step 2, where we're stabilizing the first part of the northern extension and we're building the administration building. And now we find ourselves really about to step very heavily into step 3, the building of the cargo terminals. And as we have just talked about from the damages sandwich in the previous portion of the slides, we're jumping into cargo terminal 1. And so to review the timeline again, we have put out the contract for bids, bidder selection on the 19th. We're presenting to you on the 26th. Hopefully the contract is coming to you on the 8th. And then we issued the limited notice to proceed for the long lead time items on the 12th. And then finally start really turning dirt on July 7th, 2025. And that means that we are about to start spending a lot of money. How much money? This is a graph of the planned construction costs. And I have to give the caveats. This is our estimates now. We'll know more after we actually open the bids because that's the real price, not the estimated price. But going from the best numbers we have now, from now to the end of the next calendar year, we are going to spend, I need to actually push out of the municipality, $150 million. And then in the next calendar year, we're going to push out $230 million more. The calendar year after that, $200 million more. And then finally, we should be all done hitting north of $600 million in 2028. The good news is that we have the budget for this. But I'm going to have to make some caveats about that. We inherited a project where there is budget to proceed with all these procurements because in part, the Assembly passed back in February 2024, they noted that in order to proceed with this procurement, which we're in now, we needed an approximately $663 million unencumbered budget. With how do we get to that number? You authorized us to issue revenue bonds to get to that total. At the time, we had an unencumbered budget of $192 million, so we added more to it, and actually there were a few more ordinances toward by the end, we have budget for the Terminal 1 project of $652 million. So that's how we ended up proceeding to the place we are now. But if you allow the sort of kindergarten analogy, this was something like saying you can use the credit card. But now the question is, how are we going to make the monthly payments? So we have the budget, but where does the money come from? As an aside, the one thing that's not listed on this slide is just cash that we have on hand right now. And that is because all of the cash that we have received from grants and port equity has been consumed by those first two steps, Petroleum Cement Terminal, NES administration, with two exceptions. One, we received the $100 million grant from the state that can only be used to match federal funds, so that we have to wait for more federal manna to come in before we can draw that down. And two, we received a $75 million grant from the state that we have been spending against. But in the meantime, the port has also had a short-term debt facility that is now $40 million used. So we're carrying a structural $40 million debt as well. So you can think of us having in the ballpark of some tens of millions of dollars as we start looking down the pipeline of needing to spend all that money for Terminal 1. So where does the money come from to actually push $150 million out of the municipality next year? Great case scenario, best case scenario, we finally get a judgment in the Marad case. We think that we're owed $367 million. That's with the court. There is no timeline by which the court has to actually come to a resolution on that. So not within our control. Second, we could get more grants. But as we look to next calendar year, there is really not a plausible scenario where we can bank on having $150 million in new grants in 2025. We have applied for a grant for the Terminal 1 construction in the amount of $102 million. That is a substantial portion of the entire pool of money that the Marad has to give away nationally. They had $500 million to give away for the entire country. We asked for a fifth of it. Maybe we'll get it. That'd be great. But we really can't bank on that. So there is going to be a delta, or there is very likely to be a delta. And if there is a delta, where does the money come from to make those monthly payments? There's two sources left. We could do revenue bonds or a TIPU loan. And again, I know that you are very well aware of this, but I wanted to rack it up, review the bidding.
Actually, I have a couple of questions on the previous slide.
Okay, how do I go back?
Sorry, I know you're moving
Okay, here we go.
So for grants, if we can match it with federal dollars, we still have some portion of our state grant remaining, right? We've committed 60 million of it to NES 1, I believe. And so we still have 40 million as long as we can find some federal dollars to match it with.
Yes, there's still a
Yes.
substantial portion of that $100 million grant from the state that could only be put on the street when you had federal dollars to match it. But I will turn to Mr. Adams or Mr. Rebuffo to give us the current state of play.
I think we have the same answer.
Yes, but we do actually have identified $5 million from a HUD grant that we're going to use. Another $5 million out of that state matching. So we're at 68.7 plus 5. And so we have that 100 minus that. So about 27 million remaining.
Okay. And then when we say match it with federal dollars, are they federal dollars in any form or only federal grant dollars?
But again, I'm going to practice a little law without a license here. As I understand the grant from the state, it's to match federal grants.
Okay, great. So we'll
Yeah.
want to make sure we get full clarification on that.
Yeah, through the chair, that is a great question. We'll take that away. I think we'll have to look at the appropriation language, but it wasn't very voluminous, so we should be able to get you an answer on that. Mr. Adams has a follow-up.
Yeah, but on grants, those are reimbursements from the federal government, right? From the state, we apply every 3 months, I believe, to get that reimbursement after. But for federal grants, it's a reimbursement process.
But I think the question is if it is specifically grants or if loans or other revenue sources could be viable matching alternatives. It's certainly a question to run down.
We will chase that. That is a great question. Okay, so if we have 4 and maybe 5 cash on hand Marad judgments, grants, revenue bonds, or TIFIA loans that we can bank on for next year, we can look to make our payments for next year. The last two come with an important side note. So for revenue bonds, how do you actually do the revenue bonds? Well, revenue bonds for our purposes today will equal a surcharge increase. And this is well known to you because this is a structure you created. So in the last ordinance that set this all up, it said prior to issuing any actual revenue bonds for the port, the CFO will come back to you with a resolution and say, I also need to increase the surcharge concept to actually pay the debt service. And that's, again, reviewing the bidding, a concept that we've been discussing as a municipality writ large since at least the summer of 2023. And in summary, it adds a single uniform surcharge for all the various flavors of users. So all the cargo folks are paying a uniform surcharge for the portions of the overall port modernization project that they will use. All of the cement users, whether they're the main user or the alternate universe where someone shows up with cement as well, pays a uniform surcharge for the portion that it uses, and the same thing for the petroleum users.
Anna's got a question.
And maybe you cover this in a later slide, but just generally speaking, I know these aren't forever surcharges, but what would be the general time frame? Is it 30 years? Because I know it's going to be paying off a large amount, regardless of how much of this total it's paying for.
In general, through the chair to Assemblymember Bali, in general, it is for the life of the revenue bonds or the life of the loan, because we're making the payments to clear those obligations. So you can think 30, 40 years. 40 years we're getting from the back corner. Thank you for the assist, CFO Thurn.
Okay, and the reason I bring that up, as you guys are probably thinking about, is that is a long-term commitment, right? And so I think, the move to, and not that you're proposing this, but the move to pay for all of it with revenue bonds would commit us to a very large payment, right, over time. And so just something to think about in terms of sequencing and knowing that it is a 40-year time period. That's as
Yes,
old as I am.
absolutely.
So, yeah.
Through the chair to Assemblymember Bali. And I will say, I was a little mystified by the way it had been presented in the past, because as often as not, we showed you like a 5 or a 7 year window, but I don't think anyone was trying to hide the ball. It was always intended that that surcharge would have to live for the life of the borrowing. But the slide on the board would often cut it off at 2030. We're very aware of that. And I guess another reason to say that we're presenting it in this way is that we want to be as transparent as possible and show everybody, this is jumping to the punchline, what happens if we can't find more grants or cheap financing or earmarks, whatnot, because ultimately I think we're going to be aligned and all rowing in the same direction to keep the surcharge as low as possible. Okay, so when this was presented back in July 2023, hopefully this landed with everybody that it's scalable. If you want to raise $100 million of new purchasing power, the cargo surcharge is a little bit more than $4 a ton. If you instead want to have $415 million of new purchasing power, the cargo surcharge is now $16 a ton. You'll see that math is pretty linear. And you can go all the way up to the worst case scenario of, well, we just didn't find any more money at all, and there was no one left. We had to pay for it completely ourselves. Now we're at a $53 per ton surcharge. Okay, I will dump a little bit into the weeds here because I'm not sure this is particularly well understood, but apologies if this is more detail folks really want. I wanted to emphasize that as we switched to the uniform surcharge concept, users are only paying for the project they use, but the surcharge ramps up as the whole project comes online. And what do I mean by that? So if you start with the petroleum cement terminal, it's used by 2 user groups, petroleum and cement. Is that the total cost of that project was $223 million. There was an allocation between those 2 users, and we said we're going to split that cost, $793. And so you see their allocated costs there. Meanwhile, we said the cargo users exclusively use the cargo docks, and the 2 of those are going to be $1.1 billion, or $1.2 billion rather. And finally, there's going to be some additional petroleum facility, open question whether that is now new fuel lines that are hung off the cargo docks or the original idea of a second petroleum facility. That cost is $180 million. That goes totally to petroleum. And then the move was to say, rack it all up. The total cost of the whole thing is $1.6 billion. And we'll allocate the $1.6 billion back to all of those different user groups according to their percentages. So the consequence of that, let me go backwards actually. I'll show it going forward. So we implemented that in the Terminal Tariff 10 ordinance, which is actually in front of you, as a reminder that Port Commission has to recommend a tariff to the Assembly, and that is where the port surcharge comes from. And what might be not intuitive about it is that we only have built the petroleum cement terminal yet. We've incurred some costs for the cargo terminal, but the cargo surcharge goes up too, because now the cargo surcharge is ramping up because the petroleum cement terminal was built. And as the cargo terminals are now constructed, more of the surcharge for the petroleum and cement users gets implemented. Okay, that was the design thing I wanted to mention there. Meanwhile, to remind ourselves what happened here, there was a proposal that came to the Assembly that said we would like to raise the surcharge to newly create about $85 million of purchasing power that would have put a $3.40 charge on cargo, a 91-cent charge on cement, and a 12-cent charge on petroleum. But that got amended down on the floor. And instead, we ended up, whoops, with those figures that you saw on the previous page, which you had in front of you, where we have, I think it is we have a 59-cent per ton charge on cargo. We have 12 cents on cement and 2 cents on petroleum. And that was because the decision was instead to say, we're just refinancing the debt that the port had at the time.
Thank you, Anna.
Actually, sorry, my question is probably later in the presentation because it's a separate topic. So,
Okay.
yeah, sorry.
Okay. Yep, we did just say, let's just refinance the debt because we weren't clear on particularly the design for Terminal 2.
Very good. So we ended up with a concept that's going to work for us. We know how this could be executed, but we didn't actually raise any new purchasing power then. Okay, so if we have reached the place where we're going to contemplate raising the surcharge, remind ourselves how that works. First, we take a proposal to the Port Commission, then they're going to deliberate on it and adopt it. Maybe that is 2 weeks, sort of best case scenario, probably a month, maybe a little bit more if they take more than one meeting. That goes then to the assembly. That's going to be a little bit of a process to get it ready for the assembly because it has to get turned into an actual tariff. So you have Port Tariff 11. And there's certainly going to be some time for assembly deliberation, work sessions. I'm sure this will get a lot of community attention. But the goal would be, if you're going to amend the PAMP surcharge, that would go into effect January 1st, because that's when the commercial contracts that the cargo users have rate changes, and that we would signal to everyone what the number is going to be as early as we can so they could roll it into their commercial negotiations.
So I have a couple of questions on this, and I've been talking with Mr. Gates about this a little bit. So I guess I'm uncertain what the proposed surcharge change is. Is it the overall amount we're agreeing to, right? The concept of a unified surcharge has already been approved by this body. So is it the overall amount we want to authorize to finance that needs to go back to the Port Commission? I'm just really unclear about what needs to go back to the Port Commission, because in my mind, the surcharge sits outside of the tariff. The tariff is the tariff. And while we approved a surcharge concept in conjunction with tariff number 10, that concept to me now lives and breathes kind of on its own.
So to the chair, we have had conversations with Dean Gates, and we're currently on the same page that the way it is structured now, the port modernization surcharge is part of the tariff. It is item 272 in the tariff. And we did not change anything about the way the Port Commission's law works. So we could say that those don't have to get routed through the commission. But over email, both of the lawyers were agreeing that the way it's wired now is that we're supposed to go back to the commission.
But what has to
What
go
would
back
go
to
back
the
to the
commission?
commission?
That's
Yes.
like the specific thing, because right now we've authorized you all to come back to us with over $400 million of borrowing capacity. All you have to do is come back and say, now's the time. Please say yes to issuing revenue bonds.
Right.
So I'm not sure what we would go back to say, hey, Port Commission, we need authorization to do something more.
The ordinance that the body passed said that we will come back to you, but it didn't say that we don't have to do it through the tariff. And so the words on the page now for the municipal code say, in order to raise the tariff, in order to raise the surcharge, we have to amend item 272 of the port tariff, which goes through so we would change this table. The Port Commission would say the answer is not 2 cents per barrel on petroleum. It is now 15 cents. That can be changed, but right now your council and our read is both that it's supposed to go to the Port
Okay,
Commission.
well, that feels like a structural flaw in the whole thing, in my opinion, partly because it adds unnecessary steps when we've already said it can happen. And then frankly, the Port Commission can then just undermine the legislative authority that's already been provided. So, Mr. Gates, I hope you're taking notes. Also, we want to make maximum flexibility for the issuance of revenue bonds. And when we were going to have to, and actually we did give an authorization for the issuance of revenue bonds when we thought we were going to have issues with NES1 for the delayed NEPA. We did not have a Port Commission step involved in that. And I guess I'm a little bit curious about what the difference is, or would that have ultimately have had to go back to the Port Commission before those revenue bonds could have hit the market?
Yeah, to the chair, I think it's the latter. So you authorized the additional $68 million of revenue bonding capacity, but if those are actually going to be put on the street, there would have had to be an attendant surcharge increase, and at least our read now with Assembly Council is that would have had to go to the commission.
Okay, Chris?
Yeah, I think that I just want to make sure I understand as well. So what goes in, which has been requested, is not the bond amount. It's that what we're going to pay for it, the bond, right? It's how we're going to pay for it that we have to account for in some payment structure. There is a question on, so the Assembly approves moving forward with revenue bonds for construction of Terminal 1, period. Then it goes to the Port Commission. Isn't it kind of ministerial at that point? I mean, we have this project, we're doing this project, this is the cost. Your question isn't, are you going to slide this up or down? Your question isn't really, I don't know what the question is to the Port Commission when we are at the point where it's time to construct and pay.
Yeah. Through the chair to Chair Constant, I think there's a way of looking at it in which we would have ample fodder to say, we don't actually need to go back to the Port Commission. Let's make that clear in ordinance. The alternative could be that, well, maybe there are things to murder board, which is to say, you could say, we want $150 million or pick a number of additional purchasing capacity, and it needs to be supported by a surcharge, but you could have that surcharge ramp up over time, for instance. Or you could say, we don't want to do 1 year, we want to do 2 years in one bite. Ultimately, it's going to be an Assembly decision. So it really is, I guess that is the right question. What value are you looking for the Port Commission to add? And if the
Right.
answer is there's not a lot of value,
And
then
I don't
maybe.
object to them sitting on the question, making advice. I wonder if it is like, again, this weird interstitial space between advisory and quasi-judicial. It's this, do they actually have the ability to block us? I don't think that they do. And so the question then becomes, what is the function over there? And I don't object to going there, but for the time, taking a month might be an awful lot. But anyhow, I just trying to zoom in on what their function is and why.
No, it's a good flag, and I think partly why we were hoping to put this on the board so we had a shared understanding.
Mr. Rebuffo?
Yeah, not in code, the magic word is they promulgate the tariff. So as we understand that to be, is we look at what the expense requirements are for the port for a period of time. We do all that analysis. And from that, we determine a rate structure that will cover all those costs for the foreseeable future. They set the rates to cover those costs, or they recommend to the Assembly what that rate structure should be to cover those costs, and write a resolution. And it's a resolution based on their recommendation. It goes to the Assembly. Assembly makes the final decision. I think it's the same construct for this. In this case, though, it's, the CFO's office working with the bond folks to figure out how much we're going to borrow. We know what it's going to cost us to cover that debt service, and CFO's office will recommend a rate structure for the surcharge that needs to be put in place. And that's what the Port Commission will review and agree to and recommend that the Assembly put in place to follow the construct that, their only responsibility, quite frankly, in code is to make tariff adjustment recommendations to the Assembly.
Thanks. Randy?
Mine was similar. So essentially, it's kind of like planning and zoning. It's an informed, expert, let's say, based recommendation that we can choose to follow, alter, or not follow.
That's correct. And you've done a mixture of both, in my experience.
Yeah, one of my concerns is that the PAMP surcharge that is related to specific things gets tied up in the overall tariff conversation and could get delayed. Also, that it may not have the flexibility to adjust the surcharge should it be appropriate. Should we be planning for revenue bonds and we secure TIFIA or we secure a grant? And so that flexibility then isn't built into the surcharge concept. So I think some of it's just TBD, but I think it's really good to have this conversation to think through and to go back and look at the original tariff ordinance, or the ordinance, because if it's promulgate is very different than advise. And so I want to make sure we're kind of getting all on the same page with the necessary flexibility. Yeah, Chris.
This kind of fits in my theme for the day. Planning and zoning is like a great example because there are decisions the Planning and Zoning Commission makes that you'll never see as a member of this body. It's just done, final action once it hits Planning and Zoning or the Planning Board or other boards. And so, I am very interested in us understanding the nature of this commission in relationship to this broader project, because I don't want to fall into a trap.
And that's historically not how the Port Commission has worked. They make recommendations only. They make no final decisions on anything associated with the tariff.
Thank you. Yeah, very important process conversation, because this will outlive most of us on this body or in our service. This is a long-term project. Would you like to continue, Bill?
Yeah, this could literally outlive a lot of us. Right. All right, so we're going to play out this scenario. So the MARAD judgment has not arrived. New federal grants have not arrived. Backs against the wall. We say we got no other option other than to either just dig into the municipal cash pool or issue $150 million of revenue bonds. What does that actually look like in 2025? Depending on when you sell the revenue bonds themselves, you either have one debt service payment in 2025 or two. In this scenario, we said one, so there's actually a two-step dance. So in 2025, right now, and then that's the two-step dance, then it goes to 2026. Right now, the cargo surcharge for the PAMP surcharge is 59 cents a ton. In 2025, we need to issue $150 million of revenue bonds, it's $3.15. And then starting in 2026, it's $6.44. And it goes until that bond is done, 40 years. Meanwhile, petroleum is at 2 cents. Next year, it would go to 10, and then it would land at 21 per barrel. And finally, cement is currently at 12. It would go to, my lines got messed up. It would go to 43 and then to 88. Before I go to the next slide, I'll say part of the reason for putting these numbers on the board is to say this could be reality if we don't have any other option. And so I want to make sure that is clear to everyone, and also to say we're always trying to avoid this reality by finding grants, drawing down the $100 million, winning the MARAD lawsuit. But at the end of the day, this is a very expensive project, and it feels unlikely that we will not end up having to spend at least 10% or 20% of it on our own. So someday, something like this, in this sort of order of magnitude, may well come to pass. And I don't want to be shy about that.
Chris?
The sidebar, but the 21 cents on petroleum, didn't we have some kind of a free trade deal with the fuel coming across the port? Aren't we limited in what we can charge?
Well, we operate a foreign trade zone, I think is what you're thinking about, which has no effect
Okay,
on this.
thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, Randy.
I think you answered this in the past, but a bond rating, this won't affect our rating, correct? By borrowing this much money.
And I'll say the answer to that, it shouldn't affect any part of the current municipal bond ratings because it is wholly separate and in the enterprise. But when you do these revenue bonds, you get a new rating. So there would be a rating associated with this enterprise. Ross Griswold is not shaking his head. Yes or no? Yes, he says yes. Okay, and putting those numbers on the board, it is also striking that things like petroleum increased by about 10%, 10 times, 10x. It goes up pretty significantly. I did want to say that because we changed course, it might be worth knowing to say that the original way we paid for the petroleum cement terminal was that it was heavily subsidized by all of the grant money we had ever received, and then we basically had a plan to pay that off just through wharfage and dockage. That was the plan that was in place for 2020 and 2021. And the rates in 2021 and 2020 and 2021 were higher on cement and petroleum than they are today, all in. So in some ways, if we end up in a scenario where we're issuing revenue bonds of $150 million and changing the surcharge as it was displayed on the previous slide, we're really kind of turning charges that got winked off back on for those two commodity users. Just a note. Okay, the fourth thing that was on the first slide was
Actually, what is the column here for Series A bonds? Like your third column on the last slide, you didn't go over what the comparison point is, or if you did,
one
I
more
missed
slide
it.
backwards.
Yeah,
One more backwards.
the
Okay, that's
forecasted
going to
new
come. That's going to
surcharge.
come. We're almost done, by the way. We only have about 4 or 5 slides left, and that will be the punchline for the TIFIA story.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
That's fine. Thanks.
Okay, so our fourth scenario is potentially a preferred scenario, which is the TIFIA loan. And I want to review this to make sure we all see this the same way. It is cheaper financing for a portion of the project that comes with some strings. So Transportation Infrastructure Finance Innovation Act, TIFIA, it's a loan. It's attractive because they give you an under market rate. But you do have to pay it back. It's not free money. And I think that is very clear to every one of you. A loan with a 1 basis point above the 30-year treasury, which would be better than we would do in the market if we issued our own nonprofit revenue bonds. It's not free to get, though. When you apply for this, you have to pay a bunch of costs just to generate it on our side, and you reimburse the Build America Bureau for its cost. We just had a great conversation with them. I think it was yesterday. What was that? 2 days ago? Well, we clarified all this, but the all-in transaction costs of applying for and receiving a TIFIA loan are about $1.3 million, which means that we'd like to do it once, and that informs the decisions about whether to do multiple applications. Because it is a federal action, much like Manager Pearson was describing previously, there is a requirement to engage in National Environmental Policy Act analysis before you get it. And that affects the timing considerations because you have to have the NEPA documents, your environmental assessment, hopefully, in hand before you're actually turning dirt, because the federal government wants to say you have fully thought about all the environmental consequences before you actually did the thing. One thing that I will tell you was unclear to me, but which I am flagging here because it was new to me, is that TIFIA can only finance a minority portion of a project. It is capped at 33% of the eligible project costs. I think to first order, eligible means things that were addressed in the NEPA document. Okay, so what are we thinking about for TIFIA? We have 2 options in front of us, and we are still working our way through them. The first is part of the petroleum cement terminal received an environmental assessment because we got a grant, and it received it before that construction was complete. So we think we can turn around backwards and say, actually, we would like to refinance some of the project costs with a low-cost TIFIA loan for the portion that had the EA. Now, I think that feels very good, like we could do that. Remember, it will cost us $1.3 million to do that. It still probably pays off. But the other option is to say, can't we roll it all into a bigger TIFIA ask, where we say we want the TIFIA loan for the prior expenditures that we can refinance, plus all of our post-NEPA cargo dock costs. We are working through that. And as Manager Pearson said, we got an early signal when we first arrived as an administration that, oh my goodness, these timelines are going to be potentially very challenging. But we got a much better signal when we actually spoke to MARAD on the phone earlier this week. And it looks like we are more confident that this story will end well. How much cheaper is it? We'll have to quantify that for you when we get all the stuff sorted out, but here's an indicative example. When we asked Ross to create this table, he said if we went to market, we would borrow at 4.88%. If we got a TIFIA loan, the rate on that would be 4.35. So it's pretty clear revenue bonds cost more. And if you took an example where you just said, let's pretend like we were either issuing $100 million of revenue bonds or we were taking out a $100 million TIFIA loan, that difference of about 0.5% means our annual debt service would be reduced in the TIFIA option by $750,000. And remember, that's for 40 years. So it's not nothing. It ends up saving you about 10% of the whole project cost, or sort of in that ballpark. So this is certainly the preferred option if there's no free money. MARAD judgment grants still beat this, but if we have to borrow, this looks like the best way to borrow.
Thanks. I have a quick question about that, which is if we find there are cheaper ways to borrow in the future, can we then pay off our TIFIA debt with those other cheaper ways and basically refinance that debt sooner rather than later? So kind of chase cheaper debt or chase more expensive debt with cheaper debt.
That is a question I don't know. I do recall seeing something about prepayments on the website, but I will look to the audience to see if the audience happens to know the answer. Yeah. For the online viewers and for the record, Ross Riswald said that we are working that question. We actually don't know what the prepayment terms are, but it may be academic because it is unlikely that we would find a lender who could give us a better rate than the TIFIA rate.
Well, I don't think it's academic because we also got grant funding The question is, right, what's the intersection between all of
Oh, I
these
see.
various
Yes.
pots of money, and how do we end up kind of getting out of any of the most expensive debt we might have with something cheaper? We've refinanced debt in the municipality before simply to bring down the cost of the debt. So if we can just kind of be educated on that to the extent, not a terrible deep dive,
Yeah.
but enough to know if we're locking ourselves into something that doesn't have flexibility.
To the chair, that is absolutely right. I got that wrong. You got that right. It is not academic, because if the grants come, then if there is no prepayment penalty, and I think that's what I read online, then we could start to retire the principal obligation of the TIFIA sooner, and we would be much better off.
I would add that we are sitting at 4 point whatever on the market right now, but we are maybe not at a historic high, but we're at a relatively high point for the last 15 years. And so if the rates come down significantly and we find an alternative means that isn't grants, free money, but is money at a cheaper cost, it's possible. So it certainly is worth understanding the repayment terms.
So we will definitely chase that, and through the chair to Member Constant. Remember, both of those float too. So because the TIFIA loan is tied to the 30-year treasuries, if market rates have moved wildly, then the TIFIA rate may move wildly. I don't know if you could refinance an existing TIFIA loan with a new TIFIA loan, but we'll look into that.
And I think ultimately that's a pretty important question, because if it's a fixed rate at whatever that percentage is the day you lock in, that's one thing. But if it's a, balloon rate or some kind of a floating rate, that's a little scary. But that's certainly something to contemplate.
Okay, and so to bottom line, what that means for the surcharge concept, if we are now in the world where instead of adjusting the PAMP surcharge for revenue bonds, but are instead adjusting the PAMP surcharge for TIFIA borrowing, you see that all of the charges that we listed on the prior table are now smaller. So cargo has gone from 59 cents, not to 3.15, but instead to 2.68, and is ultimately going to land at 5.67. But we're in the same place with our ability to keep making payments to our construction contractor. Okay, so here is a recommendation, and this is where we continue to be thought partners with each other. The current thinking is that we would like to put the train on the tracks to effective January 1st, move towards raising the PAMP surcharge to support approximately $150 million in revenue bonds. And then we will either actually issue the bonds or secure a TIFIA loan, or I should say, or scuttle the whole thing because we end up getting a federal grant or we end up getting MERAD judgment. Meanwhile, we're going to keep pursuing all those other funding options. And here's the thing I want to underline, and this invite some conversation, I'm sure. I think as we sit here now, that there is no risk of over elevating the PAMP surcharge in about this amount in the near term, because even if we get free money, the MERAD judgment and additional grants, we're ultimately going to need that surcharge capacity and borrowing, because the grants that we do get often require a match and are paid on a reimbursable basis. So there's often a significant lag. Some of the grants that we received years ago, we still don't have, which either means we're floating it in municipal cash pool or we're doing some kind of internal behind the scenes municipal issue. But, we're not going to float hundreds of millions of dollars for a very long time. But we're also going to continue to need to spend much, much more after 2025. And again, at least is the administration's current view that absent some big change in the universe, it is unlikely that at the end of the day, we're not going to end up having to pay for something like 10 or 15% of this whole project, and that it might well serve us better to get into this posture sooner. If we don't get full funding from some exogenous source, the idea would be to come back and do this adjustment every calendar year, where we're looking at January 1st, again, to try to align to the commercial interests. I know we have a lot of conversation that this is likely to spur, but I didn't want to surprise anybody if we found ourselves with no other alternative as we got closer to the end of the year. And I want to invite community conversation about this. So this is, I think, my last slide, a reminder of the amount of money we're spending. But next steps, we're going to hear from you.
You should just stay back at the last slide.
All right, we'll go back to that.
I got lots of hands.
Yeah, I'm going to just do the punchline so that I can get back to that, because this is just to say, I want to hear from you guys, which is what you want to do. We think we're going to the Port Commission. Maybe we're not. We'll decide that. But ultimately, I do think we're actually at a very good place as a group, as a community right now, because I feel like we have total alignment or something close to total alignment about what we want to construct. And now if we're all seeing what it looks like if we don't find free money, then I think we want to work with the port user groups and invite everybody in to say, let's align all of our educational and lobbying efforts and see if we can't all row in the same direction. That's the last slide, but I will go back to the discussion page.
Thank you. I love you underscoring the community conversation. I bring up the port at every community council and everybody's eyes glazes over.
Yep.
So I have probably the most uncontroversial, but maybe one of the most important reports to my community councils, and they just aren't terribly interested yet. Anna, then Chris.
Thanks. And I appreciate the comment about getting everybody to the table. I just want to underscore, I think, what you guys already know, which is that also needs to include our state partners and our federal partners. Because, well, one, because they have secured us money before, and I think have not heard an update in a while of where we are. Granted, a lot of them are out knocking doors and so on because they have other things on their mind. But I do know that it is something that we need to be proactively engaging the congressional and again, you guys know these things, but I want to say them again because the last conversations I've had with a few people was they did not feel informed or updated. And I know that's because we're still working through these things. But the other things that I've heard that I just want to put on the table again, because we exist in this much larger ecosystem, and there is a tendency to do things to Anchorage, right? So we have to be making sure that we're showing up and saying that it is not just doing things to us. One of them is there's been kind of very preliminary discussion about a general obligation bond. I know that was discussed last session. It will come up again. I've heard, I don't even remember from who, it wasn't from anybody in this room, that the port could be a project for a GO bond. And of course, that is also something where we're having every person in the state, right, having to pay something or, indirectly. But either way, I think there's also the conversation of if we have to do these tariffs, we have an interesting leverage point, which is that everybody will pay some of this anyway, right? Because most of the goods go through our port. So I think it's really important to proactively be including those folks, not the entire legislature, but we know who those folks need to be, including Murkowski's office, who has been very good about securing funding. And then given the timeline, even if we got $1 billion from the state, which we will not get, we cannot get that by January 1st, 2025. So we need to be having those conversations about what will happen or what can happen before they're even going to be gaveling in and have an opportunity to potentially give us grant funding. And then the other thing just to put on the table is legislative program. We need to decide what we're asking. Last year, we did not make an ask for the port. We literally just said, thank you for protecting the money that you already gave us. But we have never said that was the last time we're going to come back with funding. So we also need to figure out quickly what our ask is going to be. Again, knowing that the timing of this doesn't allow for that money to get to us in time to not have to do these other pieces. But I just want to make sure that we're connecting all those conversations. And then again, we have gotten out of the habit of being, I think, good partners with our prior administration issue, good partners with a lot of our partners. And I appreciate all the work that has been done to continue to build that relationship back, but we need to be mindful of that. Thanks.
Thanks, Anna. Chris. Go
May I
ahead.
respond quickly, just through the chair to Member Raleigh? Absolutely. This is something that we've been discussing already, is how do we further strengthen the cadence and nature of our updates to, specifically with respect to the port, to delegation staff? How do we utilize our relationships with the different members of our delegation who have different strengths? And so absolutely, and if you wanted to discuss this further offline, I would be happy to, because it's something that we've kind of we put in the parking lot this week as what are we going to, it's picking up next week, the discussion, but we are absolutely cognizant of the need to make sure that we're continuing forward with a strong legislative program specifically tied to this on both the state and federal level.
And I'll just briefly add too, I think making sure that the conversation is not just we're informing you what we're doing and coming at the end of our process, but to go and have that more collaborative discussion all the way through, because I think they would appreciate that.
Chris.
Yeah, thanks. And to that end, once we are to the point where we've kind of adopted this final program and we have a financial plan that's in order minus any money from heaven, that we work together with the lobbyists from the operators, with our lobbyists at the state and local level to create a campaign, a lobbying campaign that is jointly manned or staffed by our lobbyists. And I think we spoke to our federal lobbyists about that last week when they were here. And so people are interested in bringing together the various tools, thinking of it like during the statehood era when they sent shadow delegations. Doesn't matter who's in power, you're sending representatives who speak well to both sides of the debate. I think that that's a really important piece to keep in mind, that we can multiply our forces in DC when we have a program everybody agrees on. And so that's ultimately going to be the key to being successful at securing additional federal and maybe state support. My question was on this slide though, the 150 million, that's kind of anticipated 1-year construction cost.
Yes, through the chair to Member Constant, that is the number that we anticipate going out of the municipality from now to the end of calendar year 2025 for Terminal 1. Rough number, yeah.
Right. So that's with your slide that has the numbers kind of escalating with the red line.
Right.
But the TIFIA loan isn't tied to that number, right? The TIFIA loan conversation is 1/3 of the total package.
Correct. There is some nuance to the TIFIA loan question
Right.
because it has to be post NEPA construction. There's one scenario we get all of the cargo docks plus the retrospective costs that are eligible for PCT. There's maybe a more likely or maybe a more comfortable scenario where we lose one season of the cargo project, but we get everything else. But yeah, so with some caveats, yes.
And so at some point, and I understand it's like too many moving sliders to really demonstrate in a table at this time, but the idea would then be like you had the tariff rate increases, the cost rate increases over time and associated to the project elements of the year. So kind of helping us to visualize the annual cost, the several years cost, and then how we're funding those, just so we can visualize it.
Yeah, through the chair to Member Cons, absolutely. That seems, we recognize that to be an unfinished piece of this presentation, which is, again, you could say if no one helps, if there's no one that comes out of the woodwork and we are stuck doing this entire thing with revenue bonds, we're back to that $1.3 billion surcharge that ends at $53 per ton. What does that look like and how does it ramp up? And we can prepare that.
And we should, and then we
Right.
should
And
scale
I agree. I think
responses to the feds. Like, this is what you can do for your constituency. If you're able to fund, then we can slide this down and, again, relieve the cost of a banana. And so, okay, I just want to be sure folks understand that 150 is 1 year.
Thanks. So I have a couple of questions. So the 150 issued, I understand it's 150 million cash we're going to be pushing out by the end of 2025. Do we think if we choose to issue revenue bonds this fall, right, and so that it's on sequenced in timing, I guess my question is more around, I just don't want to overpay, I guess, right? And so if we give you the whole 150 in one chunk, I get it, like you need the cash in hand, but right, we're kind of rolling the dice on timing a little bit, I guess is what I was going to say. And I guess I would like to understand a little bit more about what's the total amount of a TIFIA loan we could get under the various scenarios. Knowing it's going to cost us something, then what are we going to get? One of my concerns with the surcharge structure as it's contemplated being used is that we're going to stack surcharges over time. And we're going to lose track of the incremental costs. So I think the modeling is important. And then maybe having this conversation of, do we simply go year over year, or do we look at a maybe 2-year model or a slightly broader model if we know we're ultimately forecasting that we're going to pay for blank percentage of this project out of revenue bonds? Like if that just becomes a policy choice, a solid part of our plan of finance, absent replacing it with no cost opportunities, then we can plan for that and get that implemented in the best strategic way it might work. Another question I had for you guys to take offline is, I know this is a huge project. I know it sits amongst many huge projects in the municipality. If you guys need any resources to help shepherd TIFIA through any other resources we can help to kind of try to get that low cost alternative. I know it's a labor intensive process. I know Jacobs has done a lot of work on it, but if there is something we need to look at, then to bring that forward to us.
Yeah, to the chair, I think a couple of responses. Definitely appreciate that. I think going to the modeling, we agree. I think dispositionally, we want to turn all of these cards face up so that we all see the whole story to the extent we can. So we're on the same page, absolutely there. Definitely appreciate the invitation for assistance on TIFIA. I'll take that offline with Jacobs and the port and figure out what might be useful there. The last question, though, being able to have better clarity as to what the TIFIA loan principal might be, amount might be, because we know what the eligible costs are. We also want to know that number. I am told that we are likely to have a higher confidence number to be able to share with everyone after we get to meet with MARAD the first week of September. So optimistic that at least by late September that we will be able to start being a little bit more forthcoming on that front.
Cameron?
Just as we wrap up, just an appreciation for the presentation, and particularly the desire to sort of give a lot of context and background. I really appreciated that. I think it's really good to note that we're trying to track a lot of things, and as you're getting up to speed, it's really helpful for you to bring that to us as well. And I would say that's true here in other areas as well, as you bring things to us and as you get up to speed. So just really appreciated that. It really helped me a lot. Thanks.
I guess that falls into the dazzle them with detail account ledger. So I'm going to pivot the question, still port related, the never ending story. When are we going to move the first gallon of petroleum across the petroleum and cement terminal?
Yeah, through the chair to Member Constant, we are very mindful of that question. We don't have an answer that I think we can share today, unless Steve wants to correct me.
No, we don't have an answer, but I have an explanation of where we stand right now.
Okay.
It is in the hands of Marathon Petroleum to tell us. Everything that they have asked us to do with respect to due diligence, we have done and informed them that it has been done. And we're waiting for them to be satisfied that we've put ourselves in a position where they don't have to worry about being held liable for anything that would go sideways during this test. That was their big concern, was they didn't want to sell us the fuel if we didn't prove that we were capable of handling it safely. And we've done everything they've asked for. They have had that information for what's coming on a month now, and it's been crickets coming out of Findlay, Ohio. You can't hold the folks here liable. We're dealing with the headquarters back in Findlay, and it's been very quiet. And I've told that to quite a few folks who have told me that they have a way to influence that, and so far nothing's happened.
So the valves are repaired. The contract for the flush and flow is managed, and we're just waiting for them to agree to move petroleum.
Yes, to sell us the fuel. That's all we're waiting for.
Thank you.
Thanks. So one of the pieces of work I kind of wanted to come out of this work session or in the next month is a policy adopted by the Assembly on the plan of finance. I think we've said kind of where our intentions are, but we have not formally adopted a policy on the plan of finance through a resolution. So I'll work on getting something drafted either for the September 10th or the September 24th meeting. I think you all can probably predict where that will go. Start with free money, then the lowest cost money, then the lower cost money, and so on and so forth. But I think that that's probably important policy guidance for us to provide so that we can always be talking about where, and it's also transparency for the public. And then we can talk about, if we are issuing revenue bonds, where we're at in that plan of finance and what we're still either waiting on or hopeful to get. And then you all, of course, can hold us to that plan of finance and ask for our help and support on any free money opportunities we can find. So anything else? Oh, yep. Audience participation. Anyone? Yep. Okay, Dylan. Steve, pass you a mic maybe on the edge there.
Good afternoon, everybody. Dylan Faber. I get to be Matson's Community and Government Affairs Manager. I just really appreciate the presentation today and the context and appreciate all the accuracy around it. So thank you for that. want to make sure I reiterate Mattson's alignment on the crane use agreement, making sure that we are preserving the port's flexibility for humanitarian aid and military use. And so while it's listed as a risk right now, I understand us to be fairly aligned on that item. Question was asked about order timeline. We had hoped to order the cranes in June. We're still okay, but the crane market is in unprecedented times. We've got Chinese crane manufactured cranes with tariffs recently implemented on them, which shifted a lot of the manufacturing to other markets. And so we think we're still fine. We're still fine for now. Our goal is to have an agreement in principle on these agreements by September 19th. And then we're taking it to our board October to get final approvals. And so if we can get September 19th agreement in principle, I think we're pretty happy moving forward on that. Then the other thing I'd add, I like the damaged sandwich analogy, is Matson is obligated to about 20 million in liquidated damages if we do not get the cranes operational and delays the construction season in 2028. So we're also in there as part of the lettuce or what have you. So that's it for me, and always happy to take questions or meet up as needed.
Thanks, Dylan. I did have a question for you. When's your October board meeting?
I just got the text on that because I texted our admin assistant. I think it's mid to late. I think October 20. Come on, phone. 24th.
Okay, I see a little bit timing misalignment if we're set to approve crane agreements on the 8th of October. So we may want to see if we can't figure out some way to get some better timing alignment so that we can all make sure we're headed in the same direction. I would hate for us to approve something and then your board not be satisfied and we have to go back to the drawing board or whatever it may be. So hopefully we can all work that out.
I hear you.
Thanks.
And
Okay.
yeah, our board's been kept up to date on what's going on here. We have agreement in principle. I don't anticipate any issues, but totally understand your concern.
Okay, great. Anyone else? Audience participation? Go to the order. All right, with that, thank you all very much. Have a good weekend.